Alright, so last time we finally finished building the stable for the horses. Now we just kind of wait and let them multiply over time and see how that turns out. For now, I think I'm going to focus a bit more on making some money. Probably continue working on the cheese setup and try to sell a decent amount. See how much we can actually make from it. We'll also check on the animals, maybe do a bit of hunting if we come across anything, and slowly keep building things up around the ranch. And while all that's happening, I've got a bunch of stories to go through today. Some of these are honestly pretty weird. Alright, let's get into the first one. Alright, this first story is one of those situations where someone slowly realizes they might have completely misunderstood a relationship for months. So this person says that during their second year of college, they had a small friend group that basically did everything together. They all met during freshman year in the dorms and just naturally stayed close. They would eat together, study together, and sometimes stay up late hanging out in someone's room watching movies or playing games. One of the people in that group was a girl who we'll call Hannah. Hannah was known for being really friendly with everyone. She had a sarcastic sense of humor and was always joking around. She was also the kind of person who didn't seem to have much of a personal bubble. She'd hug people when she greeted them, lean on friends when sitting next to them, and casually link arms with people while walking across campus. At first, none of that seemed unusual. Over time, though, this person started spending more time talking with her specifically. It started with normal stuff like sitting together in the dining hall or studying in the library before exams. Then it slowly turned into texting pretty often, too. Sometimes it would just be memes or complaining about classes. Other times they would end up texting late into the night about random topics like movies, childhood stories, or weird things they remembered from high school. After a couple months of this, people in their friend group started making jokes. They would say things like, "You two act like you're dating already." At first, both of them just laughed about it. But after hearing that joke enough times, it started getting into his head a little. He started thinking about all those small moments that felt different, like the time she'd rest her head on his shoulder while studying, or when she would grab his arm while walking through campus crowds, or the way she sometimes texted him first thing in the morning. All of those things started feeling like maybe there was something more there. So for a while he just let things continue like that, but eventually he decided he wanted to ask her directly. One night a group of them went to a small party at someone's apartment off campus. Nothing crazy, just maybe 20 people hanging out and talking. At some point during the night, the two of them ended up standing in the kitchen talking while everyone else was in the living room. The conversation felt easy, like it always did, and in that moment he finally decided to say something. He told her that he really liked spending time with her and asked if she had ever thought about them being more than friends. Instead of reacting the way he expected, she looked genuinely surprised. She said she had never thought about them that way. To her, they were just really good friends, and suddenly everything clicked for him. All those moments he had been interpreting as signs were just normal behavior for her. That was simply the way she acted with friends. For a couple weeks after that, things felt awkward. But eventually things went back to normal between them. Looking back now, he thinks the biggest reason he misread the situation was because of everyone else constantly joking that they were basically a couple already. Once that idea got in his head, he started seeing things through that lens, even when the reality was something completely different. Honestly, situations like this happen more often than people think. And again, I'm definitely not some kind of relationship expert. I'm literally just a guy reading emails while playing a game. But sometimes when you're close friends with someone, it becomes really easy to start interpreting normal, friendly behavior as something romantic, especially if other people keep pointing it out. The good thing here is that it sounds like both of them handled the situation pretty maturely and were able to stay friends afterwards. Alright, this next story is one of those moments where someone tries to help a situation and it ends up backfiring in a way they never expected. So this person lived in an apartment with two roommates after graduating college. One of those roommates had been dating his girlfriend for almost 3 years. They seemed like a really solid couple. They rarely argued, and she came over to the apartment pretty often to hang out. But over time, something started feeling a little strange. The roommate started acting very secretive with his phone. If someone walked behind him while he was texting, he'd quickly lock the screen. Sometimes he would step outside the apartment to take phone calls. Other times he would randomly say he was going out for a drive late at night. At first, nobody really thought much about it, but after a few weeks of seeing this behavior, it started raising some questions. Eventually, his girlfriend came over one evening while he was still at work. They were sitting in the living room talking, and she asked if he had seemed different lately. Apparently, she had been noticing similar things too. She said he had been texting less, acting distracted, and sometimes disappearing for a couple hours without much explanation. She asked if anything strange had been happening at the apartment. At that moment, he had a decision to make. Part of him felt like it wasn't his place to get involved, but another part of him felt like she deserved to know what he had noticed. So he told her everything. He mentioned the secret of texting, the late-night drives, the phone calls outside. After hearing all that, she became really quiet later that night. When the roommate got home, she confronted him about it. The conversation quickly turned into a full argument, and that's when the truth came out. The roommate hadn't been cheating at all. He had actually been secretly planning a proposal. Those late-night drives were meetings with a jeweler. The phone calls were conversations with her parents asking for their blessing. He had been trying to plan everything without her finding out, and now the surprise was completely ruined. For a few days, the apartment felt extremely tense. Eventually, things calmed down and they talked everything through. But even now, he still wonders if he should have just stayed out of it completely. That's honestly a really difficult situation because from the outside it really did look suspicious. Most people would probably assume the same thing if they saw that pattern of behavior. At the same time, it's also a good reminder that sometimes there are explanations we don't immediately see. It sounds like you were just trying to help someone who felt worried about their relationship, but the timing unfortunately made the situation a lot more complicated. Alright, this next one is honestly just awkward from beginning to end. So, this person says that during their first year of university, they had a huge crush on someone in their class. They didn't talk a lot at first, but they sat near each other during lectures, and sometimes ended up in the same group. When professors assigned projects over the semester, they slowly started talking more. Sometimes they joked during class. Other times they would walk together across campus after lectures. Eventually, he started thinking about telling her how he felt, but he was extremely nervous about doing it in person, so he decided to send a message instead. He spent almost an entire hour writing it. He kept rewriting the message, trying to make sure it didn't sound weird or awkward. Finally, he convinced himself it was good enough and sent it. The moment he hit send, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The message hadn't gone to the girl he liked. It went to someone else with a very similar name. Instead of sending the message to Emily, he had accidentally sent it to Emma. Emma was another student in the class who he barely spoke to. Within seconds, she replied. Her message said, "I think you meant to send this to someone else." He said in that moment he felt like his soul left his body. He immediately apologized and explained the mistake. Luckily, she thought the situation was funny rather than weird. But for the rest of the semester, every time they were in the same classroom, he couldn't help remembering that moment. And even now, he says it might be the most embarrassed he has ever felt in his life. That kind of situation is honestly the perfect example of how technology can betray you at the worst possible moment. Sending something to the wrong person is already embarrassing. But when it's a message like that, it becomes 10 times worse. At least she seemed to handle it in a pretty good way, instead of making the situation even more awkward. Alright, this next story is a little unsettling. It starts off like a normal interaction with a neighbor, but over time, small things start adding up in a way that made this person really uncomfortable. So this person says they had been living in the same apartment building for almost a year. It wasn't a huge complex, maybe 3 floors and about 20 apartments. Most people kept to themselves, but after a while you naturally start recognizing the same faces in the hallway or the parking lot. One of those people was a guy who lived 2 doors down. At first he seemed completely normal. They would occasionally pass each other in the hallway and do the usual polite nod or quick, "Hey," nothing strange about it. After a few weeks though, the guy started being a little more talkative. One evening while both of them were checking their mailboxes in the lobby, he struck up a conversation. Just casual stuff, asking how long they'd lived there. Whether they liked the building, complaining about the laundry machines downstairs. It felt like a pretty ordinary neighbor interaction. But after that day, something changed. He started appearing in places where they happened to be. At first, it seemed like coincidence. One morning, they were leaving for work, and he happened to be walking down the stairs at the same time. Another day, they were taking out the trash, and he was in the hallway again. A few days later, they ran into him at the small grocery store down the street. None of those things were particularly suspicious on their own, but over time, the pattern started becoming harder to ignore. He always seemed to appear right after they left their apartment. Sometimes he'd ask questions that felt a little too specific, like one time he casually asked if they had gotten home late the night before. Another time he mentioned that their car headlights had been left on for a few minutes earlier that week. At that point, they started wondering how he could possibly know those details. One evening, things got even stranger. They had ordered food delivery and were waiting in the living room when someone knocked on the door. When they opened it, the neighbor was standing there. He said he had noticed the delivery driver looking confused in the hallway and thought he would help point them to the right apartment. That explanation sounded reasonable, but it also meant he had been paying attention to who was coming and going in the hallway. After that moment, they started feeling uneasy. Over the next couple weeks, they noticed other little things. If they left their apartment to go for a walk, he sometimes stepped out shortly afterward. If they came home late at night, his lights were often still on. Eventually, they mentioned it to another neighbor while chatting near the building entrance. That neighbor paused for a second and said something interesting. Apparently, several people in the building had noticed the same behavior. Nothing dangerous had ever happened, but more than one person had mentioned that the guy seemed overly aware of everyone else's schedules. After hearing that, they started being more careful. They stopped sharing casual details about their day. They made sure their curtains were closed at night. A few months later, the neighbor moved out suddenly. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. And while nothing truly bad ever happened, the whole experience left them feeling uneasy about how closely someone had been paying attention to their daily routine. Situations like that are uncomfortable because nothing technically happens. But the pattern of behavior still feels strange. When someone seems to know too much about your routine, it naturally puts you a little on edge. It's probably good that you trusted your instincts and started being more cautious. Alright, this next story is about a friendship that slowly started falling apart in a way the person didn't see coming. So this person says they had been best friends with someone since high school. They met during sophomore year and basically became inseparable after that. They had the same sense of humor, liked the same music, and spent most weekends hanging out together. When they graduated high school, they both ended up going to the same college, which meant the friendship just continued like nothing had changed. During their second year of college, they decided to move into an off-campus apartment together. At first, it was great. They decorated the place together, hosted small gatherings with friends, and generally had a pretty relaxed living situation. But after a few months, things started feeling a little different. The friend began acting distant. He would cancel plans at the last minute. Sometimes he would stay out late and not really explain where he had been. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. People grow and change in college, but eventually the pattern became noticeable. They stopped talking as much. The easy conversations they used to have started disappearing. One night, things finally came to a head. They were both sitting in the living room watching TV when the friend suddenly asked if they could talk about something. He explained that he had been thinking about moving out. Not because of the apartment itself, but because he felt like their friendship had changed. According to him, over the past few months, he had started feeling like they were moving in completely different directions. Different friend groups, different priorities, different interests. Hearing that was honestly a shock from one perspective. It made sense. College can change people a lot. But from another perspective, it felt like the friendship had ended without any real warning. Within a month, the friend moved out and into a different apartment with some new people he had met. They still see each other occasionally when visiting their hometown, but the friendship never really returned to what it used to be. Looking back, they say the hardest part wasn't the argument or the move. It was realizing that sometimes friendships don't end because of a single event. Sometimes they just slowly drift apart. That kind of situation is tough because there isn't really a clear moment where something goes wrong. Sometimes people just grow in different directions, especially during big life changes like college. It doesn't necessarily mean either person did something wrong, but it can still feel strange when a friendship that used to be so strong slowly fades over time. Alright, this next one takes place at someone's workplace, and it's one of those situations that becomes painfully awkward very quickly. So this person had recently started working at a small office. It wasn't a huge company, maybe 15 employees total, so everyone knew each other pretty well. During their first few weeks, they were mostly focused on learning the job and getting comfortable with the new environment. One of their coworkers was a guy who had been there for several years. He was friendly and liked joking around with everyone in the office. Because the team was small, people often talked casually while working. Sometimes they would share funny stories about past jobs or embarrassing things that had happened in previous workplaces. One afternoon during lunch break, a few coworkers were sitting together talking. The conversation eventually turned into people sharing stories about terrible managers they had dealt with before. Everyone had at least one story. One person talked about a boss who micromanaged everything. Another described a supervisor who constantly changed deadlines without warning. Eventually, it was this person's turn to share something. Without thinking too much about it, they started describing a manager from their previous job who had been extremely disorganized and difficult to work with. They went into a fair amount of detail. They talked about how meetings would run for hours without accomplishing anything. They joked about how that manager would send confusing emails at midnight. The rest of the group was laughing along. Then suddenly one coworker stopped smiling and said something that made the entire table go quiet. Apparently, the manager they were describing was actually someone who used to work at the same company. Not only that, but the person had trained several of the employees currently sitting at the table. In fact, one of the coworkers at the lunch table was still close friends with that former manager. The mood changed instantly. What had started as a funny story suddenly felt like a very awkward conversation. They quickly tried to clarify that they didn't mean anything personal and that every workplace has different dynamics. But the moment had already passed. For the rest of that week, they couldn't stop replaying the situation in their head, wondering whether they had accidentally offended someone they had just started working with. Workplace conversations can turn awkward really fast, especially when you don't fully know everyone's connections yet. It's easy to assume people won't have any connection to someone from a previous job. But sometimes those professional circles end up being much smaller than you expect. At least it sounds like it was more of an uncomfortable moment than a serious problem. Alright, this next story is about a situation that started as a normal online friendship, but slowly turned into something much stranger than expected. So this person says that during their final year of college, they spent a lot of time playing online games at night. It was mostly just a way to relax after classes and assignments. One night while playing, they ended up joining a random group through the game's matchmaking system. One of the players in that group was someone who went by a username they had never seen before. At first, the interaction was completely normal. They played a few matches together, joked around in voice chat, and eventually added each other as friends on the platform. Over the next few weeks, they started playing together pretty often. Sometimes it would just be a quick match or two. Other nights they would end up talking for hours while playing different games. The person on the other end seemed really easy to talk to. They had similar interests, similar sense of humor, and conversations always felt natural. Eventually they started messaging outside the game as well. They followed each other on social media and occasionally shared photos from their daily lives. Nothing unusual, just two people who had become friends through gaming, but after a couple months something started feeling a little off. The online friends seemed to know details about their life that had never been mentioned in conversation. For example, one day during a voice call the friend casually asked how a certain exam had gone. The strange part was that the exam had never been mentioned to them before. Another time they asked if the weather had improved where they lived after a recent storm. Again, that topic had never come up in their conversations. At first it was easy to assume those details came from social media posts, but then the questions became more specific. One evening, the friend asked how a particular restaurant near campus was. It was a place they had visited recently, but it wasn't somewhere they had posted about online. That's when the situation started feeling strange. Eventually curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to ask a direct question. They asked how the friend knew all those small details about their life. For a moment the other person stayed quiet, then they admitted something surprising. Before they had ever started playing together online, the friend had actually recognized them from the same university. They had seen them around campus several times but had never introduced themselves. When they later matched in the same online game, they recognized the username and realized it was the same person. Instead of mentioning that immediately, they decided to just keep talking and see if a friendship developed naturally. From their perspective, it had been harmless curiosity. But hearing that explanation felt a little unsettling. It meant that someone they thought they had met randomly online had actually been observing them in real life, before ever speaking to them. The friendship eventually faded after that conversation. Not because anything bad had happened, but because the situation suddenly felt much stranger than it had at the beginning. That kind of situation sits in a weird middle ground. On one hand, it might have just been someone who was shy and didn't know how to introduce themselves in person. On the other hand, finding out someone recognized you long before ever speaking can definitely feel a little unsettling. Even if nothing harmful was intended, it changes the way you see the whole interaction. Alright, this next story is about one of those moments where a small lie turns into a much bigger problem than expected. So this person says they had a friend group that often planned weekend trips together. Nothing fancy, usually just short road trips to nearby towns or parks. One summer, they decided to plan a trip to a small cabin a few hours outside the city. Everyone agreed to split the cost of the rental evenly. There were 6 people going, so it wasn't very expensive for each person. A few days before the trip, one of their friends messaged the group chat saying something had come up and they might not be able to go anymore. At first, nobody thought much about it. Plans change sometimes, but later that evening, someone noticed something strange on social media. The same friend who said they couldn't make the trip had posted photos from a concert happening in another city that same weekend. At that point, the situation became confusing. Why say you couldn't go because something came up if you were actually attending a concert instead? A couple people in the group started wondering if maybe the cabin trip just didn't sound fun to them anymore. Eventually, someone asked about it directly. The friend admitted that they had chosen the concert instead but didn't want to disappoint the group. So they had made up a vague excuse instead of just saying they changed their plans. At first, that explanation seemed reasonable, but the bigger problem was the money, because the cabin had been booked assuming 6 people would split the cost. With one person backing out at the last minute, everyone else had to cover the difference. That's when the frustration started. It wasn't just about the lie anymore. It was about the fact that their decision had created an extra expense for everyone else. The trip still happened and people still had a good time overall, but the dynamic of the friend group felt slightly different afterward. Trust is one of those things that can shift quickly once small situations like that start happening. Situations like that usually start with someone trying to avoid an awkward conversation. But sometimes the small lie ends up creating a bigger issue than the truth would have. It's one of those reminders that being honest early can often save a lot of unnecessary tension later. Alright, this next story is about one of those painfully awkward moments that starts off completely normal and then slowly turns into something you wish you could rewind and undo. So this person says that during their second year of university, they had a routine where they would go to the same coffee shop almost every afternoon after classes. It was a small place near campus that a lot of students liked because it was quiet enough to study but still had a relaxed atmosphere. After a few months of going there regularly, they started recognizing some of the other people who also seemed to come in around the same time every day. There were a couple students who always sat near the window, someone who usually worked on a laptop near the back wall, and occasionally a group of friends who met there before evening classes. One afternoon, while standing in line waiting to order coffee, they noticed someone a few places ahead who looked extremely familiar. At first they couldn't place where they knew the person from, but the more they looked, the more certain they became that it was someone they had gone to high school with. The person in line had the same hairstyle, the same posture, and even wore glasses that looked identical to the ones their old classmate used to wear. They started thinking back to high school memories. There had been someone in their chemistry class who looked almost exactly like that. They remembered working together on a group project and joking around during lab experiments. They hadn't spoken to that person in years, but seeing them suddenly again in a completely different city felt like a strange coincidence. After standing there for another minute debating whether to say something, they finally decided to go for it. They stepped out of line and walked up behind the person. They tapped them lightly on the shoulder. When the person turned around, they immediately started smiling and saying something like, "Hey, wait, did you go to Ridgewood High?" The person looked slightly confused but still polite. They said no, they hadn't. For a brief moment, the storyteller assumed maybe the person just didn't remember them right away. So they kept talking. They mentioned the chemistry class they had shared. They talked about the teacher who always made weird jokes during lab experiments. They even brought up a specific moment where a beaker had accidentally broken during class, and everyone had laughed about it. But the more they talked, the more obvious it became that the person standing in front of them had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. Eventually, the stranger politely interrupted. They explained that they had actually grown up in a completely different city and had never attended the school being mentioned. At that moment, everything suddenly clicked. The person they had been enthusiastically talking to for the past minute was not their old classmate. They were just someone who happened to look extremely similar. The embarrassment hit instantly. They apologized several times and tried to laugh it off, explaining that the resemblance was just incredibly strong. The stranger was actually very nice about it and even joked that they must have a long-lost twin somewhere. But even though the stranger handled it well, the awkwardness didn't disappear. The worst part was that the coffee shop was small, and after ordering their drinks, they both ended up sitting in the same general area while working or studying. Every once in a while they would accidentally make eye contact across the room, and both laugh a little awkwardly about the situation. It wasn't a huge disaster or anything dramatic, but it became one of those moments that sticks in your mind for years. Even now, whenever they see someone who vaguely resembles someone they know, they hesitate a lot longer before going up to talk to them. Moments like that are surprisingly common because our brains are really good at recognizing familiar patterns. If someone shares enough similarities with a person we already know, our mind can fill in the rest of the details and convince us it's the same person. Most people understand when a mistake like that happens, but it can still feel incredibly awkward in the moment. Alright. This next story is about a situation that started as a completely normal workplace friendship, but slowly turned into something much more complicated than expected. So this person says they had recently started working at a small marketing company after graduating from college. It was their first full-time job, and the office itself was fairly small, about 20 employees total. Because the team was small, everyone tended to know each other pretty well. People would often eat lunch together, talk about weekend plans, and sometimes stay after work chatting in the break room. One of the co-workers they became friendly with was someone who had been working there for several years already. At first, their interactions were pretty standard workplace conversations. They would talk while making coffee in the break room or occasionally work together on projects. Over time, though, they started talking more frequently. Sometimes they would walk out of the office together after work since they parked in the same direction. Other times, they would end up staying late, finishing tasks, and chatting while the rest of the office slowly emptied out. After a few months, they had built what felt like a pretty comfortable friendship. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. A group of coworkers decided to go out for drinks after work to celebrate finishing a big project. It wasn't a huge party, just 5 or 6 people from the office meeting at a small bar nearby. During the evening, the conversations gradually became more personal. People started sharing stories about previous jobs, embarrassing moments from college, and funny things that had happened earlier in their careers. At some point, the coworker they had grown close with started talking about their personal life as well. They mentioned that they had been going through a difficult relationship situation recently. Apparently, they had been dating someone for several years, but things had become complicated over the past few months. The conversation wasn't overly dramatic, but it was clear they were going through a stressful time. Over the next few weeks, they continued talking more often at work. Sometimes the coworker would vent about relationship frustrations, other times they would just talk about normal everyday things. Eventually, those conversations started happening outside of work as well. They would occasionally message each other about random topics or send funny videos. At first, it all felt completely harmless, but slowly the dynamic started shifting. The coworker began relying on them more emotionally. Sometimes they would send long messages late at night about problems in their relationship. Other times they would ask for advice about what they should do. For a while, it felt like they were just helping a friend. Then one day the coworker mentioned something that caught them off guard. They said they had finally decided to break up with their partner. At first, that didn't seem related to the storyteller at all. But shortly afterward, the coworker started acting differently. They would compliment them more often. They suggested grabbing dinner together outside of work. And during conversations, they occasionally hinted that they felt a strong connection between them. That's when the situation started feeling complicated. What had originally been a supportive friendship during a difficult time suddenly started looking like something else. The storyteller began wondering whether they had unintentionally become part of a much more emotional situation than they originally realized. Eventually, they decided it would be better to set clear boundaries. They explained that they valued the friendship but didn't want to blur the lines between personal and professional life too much. The coworkers seemed to understand, and while they still get along well at work, the dynamic between them changed after that conversation. Looking back now, the storyteller says it was a good reminder that workplace friendships can sometimes become more complicated than they first appear. Workplace friendships can be great, but they can also become complicated if personal situations start overlapping with professional ones. It sounds like you handled the situation carefully by setting boundaries. Instead of letting things drift into something confusing, that's usually the best way to avoid bigger problems later. Alright, this next story is about a situation that slowly turned uncomfortable because of something that seemed completely harmless at the beginning. So this person says that during their final year of college, they moved into a shared apartment with 3 other students. The apartment itself was pretty typical for college housing. Everyone had their own room, but they shared the kitchen and living room. At first, the living situation worked really well. Everyone had different schedules, but they still hung out occasionally in the evenings watching movies or playing video games. One of the roommates in particular seemed very friendly. He was talkative, liked joking around, and often started conversations while people were cooking or studying in the living room. During the first couple months, everything felt completely normal, but over time, something started feeling a little strange. The roommate seemed to know a surprising amount about what everyone else was doing during the day. For example, one afternoon he casually mentioned that another roommate had gotten home late the night before. The comment itself wasn't necessarily strange, but the person he said it to had never mentioned that they had been out late. Another time he brought up a specific class that someone had attended earlier that morning. Again, it seemed like a small comment, but it raised a question. How did he know exactly which class someone had attended that day? At first everyone assumed he was just making guesses based on normal routines. But the comments continued. Sometimes he would mention small details about people's schedules or errands they had run earlier in the day. Eventually, one of the roommates asked how he seemed to know so much about everyone's daily activities. The explanation he gave sounded simple at first. He said he worked from home most days, so he just happened to notice when people left the apartment or came back. But even with that explanation, some of the details still seemed too specific. The situation became more uncomfortable a few weeks later. One evening, someone left their phone in the living room while cooking dinner. When they came back a few minutes later, the roommate was sitting nearby. Nothing looked unusual, but the phone screen had been turned on. Later that night, the phone owner noticed that a few private messages had been opened. There was no proof that the roommate had looked through the phone. But the timing made the situation feel suspicious. After that moment, everyone started becoming a little more cautious. People began keeping their phones with them. Conversations in the apartment became slightly shorter. No one accused the roommate directly of doing anything wrong. But the overall atmosphere of the apartment slowly changed. Eventually, the lease ended and everyone moved into different living arrangements. Looking back, the storyteller says the experience made them much more careful about privacy when living with people they don't know very well. Living with roommates can sometimes reveal habits or behaviors that you wouldn't normally notice in other settings. Even small things can start feeling uncomfortable if they happen repeatedly. It's one of the reasons why sharing space with people requires a lot of trust and clear boundaries. Alright, this next story is about one of those situations where a completely normal day suddenly turns into something you remember for years afterward. So this person says that one weekend they decided to visit a nearby town that had a popular outdoor market. It was the kind of place where vendors sold handmade crafts, local food, and random vintage items. The market usually attracted a pretty large crowd, especially during warm weather. They arrived around midday and spent the first hour just walking around looking at different stalls. Eventually, they stopped at a small booth that was selling handmade wooden decorations. While they were looking at the items, another customer walked up to the booth. At first, there was nothing unusual about the interaction, but after a few minutes, the vendor started acting a little strange. The vendor kept looking back and forth between the storyteller and the other customer. Then suddenly, the vendor asked a question that confused both of them. The vendor asked if they were siblings. Both of them immediately said no, but the vendor seemed surprised. Apparently, the two of them looked extremely similar. At first, they both laughed about it, but the vendor continued pointing out similarities. They mentioned the shape of their faces, the way their hair fell, and even the way they stood while looking at items. After hearing all that, they started studying each other more closely. And the strange thing was, the resemblance actually was pretty strong. Neither of them had ever seen each other before. They were from completely different cities. But standing there in that moment, it was easy to see why someone might assume they were related. The situation became even more surreal when a few other people nearby overheard the conversation and joined in. Several of them agreed that the resemblance was unusual. Eventually, they both ended up laughing about the whole thing and taking a quick photo together as a joke. They exchanged social media accounts afterward just to share the photo later. Even though they weren't actually related, the encounter turned into one of those strange coincidences that makes you wonder how many people in the world might look similar to you without you ever realizing it. Encounters like that are a good reminder of how many people exist in the world who might share similar features. Sometimes complete strangers can look surprisingly alike, even without any connection. It's one of those random moments that can make an ordinary day suddenly feel memorable. Alright, this next story is about a situation that started as a completely normal late-night walk, but slowly turned into something that made this person very uncomfortable. So this person says that during their last year of university, they had a habit of going for short walks late at night. It wasn't anything unusual for them. After studying for hours in their apartment, walking around the neighborhood for 20 minutes helped them clear their head before going to sleep. The neighborhood itself was generally quiet and safe. Most of the buildings nearby were student apartments, and there were usually still a few people walking around even late in the evening. One night, around 11:30, they decided to take their usual walk. They followed the same route they normally did, which went past a small park and then looped around a few residential streets before returning to their building. About halfway through the walk, they noticed someone standing near a streetlight ahead. At first, there was nothing particularly strange about it. The person appeared to be looking at their phone. But as they walked past, they noticed the person briefly look up and watch them. Again, that wasn't necessarily unusual. People glance at strangers all the time, so they continued walking. A few minutes later, they turned onto the next street, expecting to complete the loop back toward their apartment. But when they glanced behind them, they noticed something that made them pause. The same person from the streetlight was now walking in the same direction, a short distance behind them. At first, they assumed it was just coincidence. After all, the streets in that area connected in several ways, and it was entirely possible the person was simply walking the same route. Still, the feeling lingered. They kept walking for another minute or two. Then they slowed down slightly to check something on their phone. When they did that, the person behind them also slowed down. That's when the situation started feeling strange. To test the idea, they crossed the street and turned down a different path that wasn't part of their usual route. A moment later, they heard footsteps crossing the street as well. Now the uneasiness turned into genuine concern. Instead of continuing down the quiet street, they quickly headed toward a nearby convenience store that they knew stayed open late. The bright lights and people inside immediately made them feel a little safer. They stepped inside and pretended to browse some shelves while watching through the glass window. The person who had been walking behind them passed by the store entrance and kept walking down the street. Maybe it had been coincidence after all. Maybe the person had simply been walking the same direction. But the whole situation left them feeling uneasy enough that they decided to skip late-night walks for a while, even now. They say that moment taught them to trust their instincts when something suddenly feels off. Moments like that can be difficult to interpret because sometimes coincidences really do happen. But when your instincts start telling you that something feels strange, it's usually smart to listen to that feeling and move toward a safer environment. Even if nothing actually happens, being cautious is always better than ignoring that sense of discomfort. Alright, this next story is about a friendship situation that slowly changed in a way the person didn't expect. So this person says they had been friends with someone since early high school. They met through a shared class and quickly became close because they had very similar interests. Both of them liked the same music, watched the same shows, and often spent weekends hanging out together. Over the years, their friendship became one of those connections that felt extremely reliable. They helped each other through exams, stressful school situations, and even some difficult family problems. When they graduated high school, they went to different universities but stayed in contact regularly. They would still message each other about random things or call to catch up every couple weeks. Everything seemed completely normal, but during their third year of college, something started changing. The friend began responding less often. Messages that used to get replies within hours sometimes went unanswered for days. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. At first, the storyteller assumed the friend was simply busy. College schedules can get overwhelming, but eventually something else became clear. The friend had started spending most of their time with a new group of people they met at university. Again, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. People naturally form new friendships in different stages of life. The problem came when the tone of conversation started changing. During one visit back to their hometown, the storyteller met up with the friend in person for the first time in months. The conversation felt slightly awkward from the beginning. Topics that used to come easily now felt forced. At one point, the friend casually mentioned that some of their new university friends had very different opinions about people who stayed close to their hometown social circles. Apparently, they thought it was important to constantly move forward and leave old connections behind. Hearing that comment made the storyteller realize something uncomfortable. The distance between them hadn't happened randomly. The friend had slowly started viewing their old friendships as something less important. After that meeting, they continued speaking occasionally, but the closeness that once existed never fully returned. Looking back now, the storyteller says the hardest part wasn't the disagreement or the awkward conversation. It was realizing that sometimes people change in ways that make old friendships fade naturally. Friendships can evolve over time, especially during big life changes like college or moving to new environments. Sometimes people develop new priorities or perspectives that slowly shift the dynamic of older friendships. It doesn't always mean someone intentionally ended the friendship, but it can still feel strange when the connection isn't the same anymore. Alright, this final story is about one of those awkward public situations that becomes unforgettable because of how unexpectedly it happens. So this person says they were attending a large university orientation event during their first week on campus. The event took place in a huge auditorium filled with hundreds of new students. Various speakers were introducing different campus organizations, clubs, and activities that students could join. After about an hour of presentations, the host decided to do a short interactive activity with the crowd. They asked students to raise their hands if they had traveled from out of state. Then they asked people to stand if they were the first in their family to attend university. The idea was to get students involved and create a sense of connection. Eventually, the host asked if anyone in the audience had an unusual or funny story about their first few days on campus. To their own surprise, the storyteller raised their hand. They had experienced a small mishap the day before involving getting completely lost while trying to find a lecture hall. The host invited them to come up to the stage and briefly share the story. Feeling nervous but excited, they walked up in front of the large audience. They began explaining how they had accidentally walked into the wrong building multiple times while searching for their classroom. The audience laughed along as they described the confusing campus layout. Then they reached the part of the story where they mentioned mistakenly walking into what they thought was a lecture hall but turned out to be a professor's private office. Without thinking, they jokingly added a comment about how the professor looked extremely annoyed by the interruption. At that moment, the host asked which building the office had been in. When they answered, the host's expression suddenly changed. The host explained that the professor they had just joked about was actually sitting in the audience that day. For a brief moment, the entire room went quiet. Then people started laughing again when the professor stood up and waved. Thankfully, the professor seemed to take the situation with humor. But standing on stage in front of hundreds of people while realizing the person you just joked about was in the room created a moment the storyteller says they will probably never forget. Public speaking can already feel nerve-wracking, and unexpected moments like that can make it even more memorable. Luckily, it sounds like the professor had a good sense of humor about the situation. Sometimes the most awkward moments end up becoming the funniest stories later. Alright, I think that's all the stories I have for today. Honestly, some of these were pretty interesting. A few of them were just straight up uncomfortable to listen to. Thanks to everyone who sent their stories in. I appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, you can subscribe if you want to see more of these. I'll probably keep working on the ranch and reading more stories like this. And if you've got your own story that you want to share, you can send it to the email in the description. I read through all of them. So there's a good chance it might end up in a future video. Anyway, I'm going to keep working on this for a bit. I'll see you in the next one.